Continuing our coverage at Families USA Health Action 2013. Joining me now is Paul Vandewater. He is a senior fellow at the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, where he specializes in Medicare, Social Security, and health coverage issues, all very much in the news for a myriad of reasons,
That's
some
right,
that we
Sam.
don't like. Paul, so all right, let's start with Social Security, and we'll one of the proposals that's been on the table has been chaining the CPI. It's essentially a recalculation of the cost of living. It amounts to a cut. Am I accurate in describing it that way?
Absolutely, there's no doubt about it. The chain CPI it's a technical issue, but it's an alternative way of measuring increase in prices, and it results in an increase each year of about 0.3% less than the measured inflation you get from using the standard consumer price index, which is the current way in which Social Security benefits and the tax code and other federal programs are now indexed. So that means that if you switch to this alternative CPI, the chain CPI, initially the effect would be very tiny. It would just reduce the cost of living increase by about 0.3%. But after 10 years, obviously that adds up to about a 3% cut, or after 20 years, about a 6% cut. So it is a real benefit reduction. That's not an issue.
And it also, on top of the fact that there's an argument out there that the existing CPI undermeasures inflation specifically for people who are of age to be on Social Security.
Yes, there's a separate experimental consumer price index for the elderly, which the Bureau of Labor Statistics and the Labor Department puts together, and that in general shows that the cost of living for the elderly tends to go up a bit more rapidly than the cost of living for other folks because the elderly spend a larger share of their income on healthcare costs, and healthcare costs have been tending to grow more rapidly than other types of costs.
Now, why is it that you can take 2 minutes, completely explain that dynamic to me, okay, with perfect clarity for someone who is, not trained in policy per se? But yet we hear Nancy Pelosi will come out, let's say, for instance, and say the CPI is not a cut. It's a technical fix. Is this just politics? Are they giving themselves some type of room? Because this may or may not be on the table. It certainly was on the table maybe 6 weeks ago in terms of dealing with the so-called fiscal cliff. But give me your perception.
Well, I don't want to speculate what Nancy Pelosi had in mind. I'm actually a great fan of hers.
I am as well.
She's done a lot of really great things. I think if that's what, in fact, she said on this particular one, she hasn't described it quite correctly. Now, I have to say that even though using the chain CPI would be a benefit cut, we do have to put this in perspective. We are facing a time when we will be needing to make painful steps to reduce projected budget deficits, and although the chain CPI is not the greatest idea that's ever come down the pike, it may also turn out to be less bad than a lot of other choices we might be facing for reducing the deficit.
But
so I don't rule it out completely as a possibility.
How could cuts to Social Security help the deficit?
Well, Social Security is a federal program just like anything else. So reducing Social Security spending or raising Social Security taxes does, just by arithmetic, reduce the deficit.
If you include the liabilities of Social Security, but I mean, if you perceive Social Security as a program that operates, which statutorily it's not supposed to add to the deficit. Am I wrong in that?
Well, Social Security is officially classified as off budget, which gives it certain special protections in the congressional budget process. But from an economic...
Well, I understand what you said, but that presumes that the answer isn't just to give a 25% benefit cut when the trust fund runs out, right? I mean, if we do that, there's no way that we can calculate that Social Security adds to the deficit. Right? In other words, if it's self-funding now, and all the only money that is coming into Social Security from taxes outside of those specifically for Social Security are coming on interest on bonds that because the government has borrowed from it in the same way that it pays interest to anybody else. I mean, obviously, the existence of government creates a deficit, if you're going to argue that way. I mean, so Social Security is off budget. I mean, it lives or dies on its own, right? I mean,
well, Social Security is absolutely self-financing. That's clearly the case. And in fact, this year, contrary to what some people are saying, it's actually running a surplus when you look at its total budget. That is, when you include not just the payroll tax,
but the interest coming off of those bonds.
But the interest coming in, which is exactly the right, appropriate thing to do. Social Security is running a surplus. But that doesn't mean, again, just from a matter of arithmetic, that if you were to reduce Social Security benefits incrementally through the change CPI proposal, that would make the Social Security surplus in the upcoming year even larger, and that would contribute to making the federal deficit overall a little bit less than it otherwise would be. So the fact that Social Security is self-financing and in the long run isn't going to add to our deficits doesn't mean that if you were to change Social Security's financing in the upcoming years, that still wouldn't have an effect on the government's overall fiscal position.
Presuming that the government would pay into Social Security and maintain benefits, or just because it would have to, it wouldn't have to redeem those bonds quicker.
Well, if Social Security benefits were cut, and again we're talking about this hypothetically,
right.
Not we're not saying whether that's the good policy, but if it were done, it would mean Social Security would run a slightly higher surplus, and that would contribute to making the overall government deficit, Social Security plus everything else, a little bit less than it otherwise would be.
From an accounting perspective, because we do not...
Not only from an accounting, but from an economic perspective, because we care about budget deficits not for some abstract reason of accounting, but because they affect the economy. They affect how much is being taken out of the... how much the government deficit is reducing the amount that's available for private investment, for example. And when you do calculations like that, you have to look at Social Security as well. It's perfectly, it should be viewed separately because it is a separately financed program, but that doesn't mean it doesn't have a big effect on the economy as well.
Right.
You can't ignore that.
Removing the cap, let's say we took the cap. Do we have a sense of where we could raise the cap to get back to where we traditionally, to the amount of income that was traditionally subject to the payroll tax? In other words, as you know, it's been traditionally at 90%. We're down now, I think, around there, 81, 82% of income being captured. But where would that number be?
Yeah, you're exactly right that when the current mechanism for putting this payroll tax cap in place was set up in the late 1970s, it was expected that about 90% of earnings would be subject to the Social Security tax. In recent years, because of the growing disparity in earnings growth, more of the income growth has been going to people at the top, less to people in the middle of the bottom. That fraction has shrunk to the low 80s, as you said. The cap is today about $113,000. If it were raised to the point that it covered 90% of earnings, as it did in the early 1980s, it would be up at around $215,000.
$215,000?
Approximately.
And do we have a sense of how long into the horizon that would maintain Social Security's capacity to provide 100% benefits?
It would help. It would not, it would not make Social Security. It would not solve the whole 75-year Social Security shortfall by a considerable margin. It also depends upon what we do in terms of paying additional benefits on those additional taxes, because as you and I think your listeners know, your Social Security benefits depend upon the amount of earnings on which you pay tax. Higher income, higher earners don't get back in the same proportion as low earners do, because the benefit formula is progressive. That is, the highest earners get relatively less as a fraction of their pre-retirement earnings than low earners do. And depending upon how much the benefits are as a result of this increase in the tax, this hypothetical increase in the payroll tax cap, that would affect how much it would improve Social Security's solvency.
Well, right now we're at, I think it's 2031 or 2033, where we will supposedly hit that point where benefits will be reduced by 25%, assuming we do nothing. Do you have a sense, ballpark?
It's a few years. It's in the single digits. But looked at it another way.
Raising that cap just to 215 would just extend it just by half a dozen years, or
something of that order of magnitude. Put another way, if you look at the measure of what the gap is between projected benefits, scheduled benefits, and revenues under current law over the next 75 years, which is the traditional horizon used for evaluating Social Security solvency, my recollection is that it closes about a fifth or a quarter of the gap.
A quarter of the gap.
So it would make a substantial contribution, and it's not a criticism to say that it doesn't solve the whole problem by itself. It's a very from my point of view, it's a very sound proposal,
right?
And it's one that we should go ahead and do. We'll need to do other stuff as well. I mean, in fact, I even think in the longer run, raising the payroll tax rate itself is a reasonable option. Social Security is a great program. It's the only defined benefit retirement income that most people are going to have. Standard pensions, as we know, are
increasingly so.
Have
that is
disappeared
the case. Right.
For most people. So that Social Security it's a good program, and it would be worth paying a little bit more in taxes to keep it solvent.
Well, Paul Vanderwater, I wanted to get into Medicare. We got off on Social Security, which also happens to be one of my favorite topics. So I appreciate your time today from the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities.
Great to be here, Sam.